You're listening to the ASEF Governance and Economy podcast series. The recently concluded 19th Informal ASEM Seminar on Human Rights gathered representatives from governments and civil society organizations. This podcast is one in a series of interviews we had with experts on human rights education and training. We're very glad that Dr. Fernand de Varennes is here with us today. Our guest is the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues to the United Nations. When we talk about international human rights law, which is underpinned by the principle of equality, Dr. Varennes, how do you think can we ensure that minorities and disadvantaged groups have access to human rights education?
I think one of the most important steps initially is to ensure that they have access to education, but also that they have access to quality education. There's a number of studies, including a World Bank study, that shows that the largest group of children who don't have access to education or who don't attend education for a very long time are indigenous and minority children. So there are structurally sometimes issues relating to access to education, which means, of course, that if you don't have access to education, you will not have access to human rights education, obviously. So one of the first steps that need to be addressed is, first, do minority children have access to schooling? And it's not always obvious. Physically, there may be, for example, no schools in a walking distance for children from a minority background. So here you have situations where the state has obligations to provide education to children, where some states may not be fully complying with their obligations because children are too far away from schools. There might be financial restrictions also. Despite primary education, despite the obligation of that to provide free universal primary education, some governments are not fully able perhaps to comply with that. And quite often the children in that situation are from disadvantaged backgrounds, minority or indigenous children. And thirdly, there's the issue of quality education, and this is also connected to the language used in education. Once again, there's a large number of studies, including a World Bank study and other UNESCO documents, that suggest that when you do not teach in the language of children will not fully actually receive equal benefits of education, but this is also, or it can also be an obstacle in the sense that minority and indigenous children in particular, who are not taught in their own language, quit school after only a few years because they don't actually understand the language used by the teachers, and therefore they do very poorly. They actually feel in a way disrespected because we're denying that their language or culture is a worthy language in education. So we have a situation where if you don't teach in the language of children, they're more likely to only stay in school a few years. Therefore, they will not have access, or true equal quality access to education, and therefore they will not be exposed to education, to human rights education also. So I think these are some of the obstacles that we have to recognize that particularly impact minority and indigenous children and actually limit their possibilities of ever being exposed, learning anything about human rights education. So that really is the central area that we have to explore first and to recognize.
Talking about overcoming obstacles, Dr. Varennes, are there any other factors that might make human rights education more accessible?
One of the important aspects I think we have to acknowledge is that schooling has to reflect the culture and the reality on the ground. And this means that where you have, for example, indigenous or minority communities that are concentrated, schools should reflect their culture and their languages as much as possible so that students feel that their own reality is included, is part of the education experience, if you will. In other words, when you have formal education, schooling, which only reflects the majority culture, for example, it would seem that it is a form of education which can be exclusive. It doesn't recognize the presence, the importance, the value, actually, of the cultures and languages of children that might be in the schools. And I think that actually has a detrimental impact. You can have a sense of alienation, that the school is actually rather foreign, outside of the realities of these children. So in order to have a much more positive environment and a rights-based environment, you need schooling that actually respects and reflects the diversity of the children that composes the population of the school. And when you have that, I think this is a kind of environment that actually is more equal, respective of one's religion, language, or culture, and that therefore that will provide a much more positive and conducive environment in which human rights education can flourish. Because if we talk about human rights education, we also are talking about inclusive forms of education that are respectful of our human diversity. And that really means a school environment in the way we teach, what we teach, and how we teach, including the language, that is consistent with, consonant with the fundamental values that you find under human rights education. And I think this is something we don't always recognize or acknowledge sufficiently, quite frankly. But if you embark in this sense, that education reflects the diversity of the students, the children that are involved, then you're acting in a way which makes much more sense. It's more closely connected to the human rights, the fundamentals of human rights. And education and human rights education will have a more, as I said, more fertile environment in which it can flourish.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to interview you and share your thoughts on human rights education. Thank you for listening. If you want to know more about the topic of human rights education and the work of Asia Euro Foundation on Governance, visit our website, www.asef.org. Like us on Facebook at Asia Euro Foundation, follow us on Twitter at asef.org, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.